Hi, everybody. My name is Marlene Theodore. I'm the Associate Curator of Programs in the Education Department here at the Gallery, and I am a settler. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples who have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. This afternoon, it is my distinct privilege to introduce our Martin A. Ryerson lecturer, Marie Watt. Watt is a cross-disciplinary artist working in sculpture, printmaking, textiles, and collaboration. She's a citizen of the Seneca Nation, and her work centers on history, indigenous principles, Iroquois proto-feminism, and the collective experience of making art. Watt received her M.F.A. from Yale in 1996. She also holds an A.F.A. from the Institute of American Indian Arts, as well as a BA and honorary doctorate from Willamette University. Her work is held in numerous museum collections, including the National Gallery of Canada, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, the Seattle Art Museum, the Yale University Art Gallery, and as of this week, a couple days ago, the Whitney Museum of American Art. Watt has participated in many residencies, including at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and she's received fellowships from the Joan Mitchell Foundation and Anonymous Was a Woman Foundation. Marie Watt is here to help us celebrate the opening of the exhibition, Place, Nations, Generations, Beings, 200 Years of Indigenous North American Art, curated by Katie McCleary, Leah Shrestinian, and Joseph Zordin, all very recent grads of Yale. This is the first exhibition of Indigenous art to bring together works from the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, the Yale University Art Gallery, and the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History. Guided by the four themes in its title, the exhibition looks at the connections that Indigenous peoples have to their lands, the power of objects as expressions of sovereignty, the passing on of artistic principles and traditions, and the relationships that artists and nations have to animals, plants, and cosmological beings. This exhibition and the accompanying catalog contribute to the larger narrative of American art, and they emphasize the continued existence of contemporary Indigenous nations. This exhibition marks a beginning, but at the same time, it is the product of years of work. Along the way and in this process, in the summer of 2016, Katie and Leah held the Native American Arts Initiative internship that allowed them to study Native American art at Yale, travel to other institutions, and deliver a report with recommendations to the university. It wasn't a straight path, but the work on that internship led to Katie, Leah, and then Joseph having the opportunity to develop this exhibition with the support of many colleagues here at Yale and beyond. Many of you are here today. Thank you. I want to give special mention to the Mellon Foundation grant that inspired and sustained the comprehensive scope of this project that touched on teaching and research that are at the very core of our work. I encourage you all to spend time in the exhibition. I know many of you just came from there, and with the catalog, which includes an essay by Katie and Leah that Professor Ned Blackhawk describes as among the strongest he's encountered in the field. This exhibition and catalog are beautiful, monumental, and groundbreaking. Katie, Leah, and Joseph, congratulations. The title of today's lecture, First Teachers Balance the Universe, draws on Marie Watt's work of the same title, which is on prominent display in the exhibition. First Teachers was acquired by the gallery in 2018 through the work of Katie, Leah, and Joseph, and with critical support from our chief curator, Larry Cantor. Today, the work serves as an anchor in the exhibition. First Teachers Balance the Universe, Part 1 and 2, Things That Fly, Predator, and Things That Fly, Prey, that's the full title, refers to the Seneca creation story, where Sky Woman falls to the earth and animals are her first teachers, connecting the worlds of the sky and the earth, and for us here, drawing the themes of the exhibition together. This work was made using reclaimed wool blankets, embroidery, floss, and thread, and was created through collaborative sewing circles. Many of Watt's works are made through the collaborative process of sewing circles, which engages participants in art making, conversation, and community building. Tomorrow, from 12 to 3 in the gallery lobby, we can learn about this process firsthand as Marie will lead a sewing circle for work that focuses on companion species in relation to creation stories and histories, and that involves a kind of mashup, as I understand, of the words of current poet laureate Joy Harjo, the first Native American poet laureate in U.S. history, and singer-songwriter Marvin Gaye. In preparation for tomorrow's sewing circle, a group of mainly students helped me thread 900 needles. While that might sound daunting, it was actually completely lovely. As we threaded needles and talked, the students shared stories of upcoming exams, dinner plans, a gift of an embroidered jacket, memories of threading needles with a grandparent, the joy of working with your hands. It was pretty wonderful to slow down and engage in this collaborative activity of making and craft, to connect with our community around a table, and to have a window into the collaborative, generous, and inclusive process that is working with Marie Watt. I want to give a shout out to the needle threaders, Grace Winter, Allie Brussel-Faria, Sophia Corey, Chloe Glass, Eddie Dye, David Roy, Jake Gagne, Robbie Lynn Harnoy, and Elizabeth Kitson. It's a long list, but there were 900 needles. For tomorrow, all ages are welcome at Marie's Sewing Circles and no sewing experience is necessary. In exchange for stitches and time, participants will receive a screen print from Watt. I hope you'll join us. So, Marie, we are so excited to have you here today to speak about your work and your practice, your time at Yale, and this exhibition. Please join me in welcoming Marie Watt.
I have to turn on my second mic. I apologize. There we go. Oh my gosh, it's such an honor to be here. It gives me chills just being in a room with so much generosity. I hope that people had the chance to be at the blessing and kind of opening remarks today at 1 because it makes me really happy and proud to be associated with this university. And I have to share, when I started as a student, it came with its challenges. So it's like really such an honor to be here and see these the work of these amazing students and now graduates and alums. And I thought I'd start with place. And I actually am going to model my lecture today after the language in the exhibition. So I want to acknowledge the Indigenous communities, past and present, in this territory we now call Connecticut. And in the Algonquin language, this translates to Long River. Well, the image here is not of Connecticut. It does relate to the importance of water in Indigenous communities. I think if you have traffic or parking issues in New Haven, New York, or some commute to and fro, that you might appreciate this traffic or parking lot scene from Neah Bay and the M.F.A. Nation circa 1880 to 1920. Having grown up in the Pacific Northwest, this image speaks to me. It is a reminder that wherever there are bodies of water, there is a high likelihood that Indigenous people resided there and or in proximity to this site. Waterways are superhighways. They served as centers for cultural and economic exchange, rich natural resources, plentiful fishing and hunting, and fertile soil for agriculture. I was talking with my friend Marco about this image, and we started thinking, like, some of these canoes must be the convertibles, and other canoes are the kind of old beater that still kind of gets you to and fro. You have to think that, like, because it was this rich cultural exchange place too, perhaps somebody fell in love from another family, not necessarily with the encouragement of their parents. This place is also, this is another important part of this place. These are the students who helped make this exhibition possible. And as I understand it, there was a Indigenous advisory committee that was brought into this project. Yesterday, I attended a dinner at the Native American Student Cultural House, and it was amazing to see so many Indigenous people in one space on campus, and just it was heartwarming to know that it's a place where students can come and exchange and relax and feel supported. When I arrived in New Haven, I had graduated from Willamette University. I went to this place called the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then I came to New Haven, and I, quite frankly, experienced culture shock. There weren't a lot of Indigenous people here, and try as hard as I might, I couldn't find a Native community. So one of the things I did in my practice then is I really looked at things that were important to me that related to home, and so I started looking at corn husks and corn. Corn is vital in our community, and I decided that I would paint and draw from these husks, but also start sculpting with it. And I think in a painting department that firmly saw its history attached to painting, it wasn't an easy place to make these objects. So it's funny, I think I was asking this question 20 years ago, as I'm still asking it today. What would the world look like if we thought of ourselves as companion species? In this presentation, I don't necessarily have answers to the questions, but my work definitely seeks to understand. Moline actually shared a bit of the Seneca and Iroquois creation story, and I'll just sort of tell it again because it's something that I think about a lot when I think about companion relationships. So our story begins with Sky Woman, who sees this hole in the ground in the sky where a sacred tree had fallen, and as she's looking down this hole, she either falls and/or some say she is pushed through this hole. As she falls, her landing is softened by birds who assist her, and then eventually by four-legged animals. And so as a result of the way animals helped Sky Woman, we consider them our first teachers. And in our tribe then, we have 4 animals that walk the earth and 4 that occupy this sky space. You'll see that there's a deer here, and my mom said that she believes that this used to be the killdeer bird, and it's evolved. I am from the Turtle Clan, and my husband, who is non-native, is a graphic designer, and his moniker is the Raven, and so I think that there is balance in my house. Traditionally, you would actually, if you're from a 4-legged clan, you would marry an animal that flew. So it's interesting and exciting to see this piece because this is probably really one of the earliest times where I was really thinking a lot about our companion stories and really using the ideas about our first teachers to, reflect further. And so I guess what I want to share with you about this piece, because again, I'm going to remind everyone we're thinking about place. It's funny, the curators talk about this piece in relationship to place, and so it kind of has put me into the situation of thinking about how it relates to place too. And I think one thing that's great about the words place, generations, I might need some help here, place, generations, nations, and beings, thank you, is that they're intermingled. And so in this particular piece, I think it's helpful to know that the blankets are Pendletons, and I live in Oregon. The blankets are also wing-like forms to really suggest things that fly. My father was a Boeing engineer, and so there's airplanes in this piece. My husband Adam and daughter Maxine love science fiction, and so the Millennium Falcon is also present in this piece. This piece was stitched and open to the community sewing circles 3 different locations, but probably with, I don't know, 10 different communities, and there are probably about 500 pans that contributed to the stitching here. The piece, one of the things that I loved is how people actually would help even with the compositional arrangement. So when I was working at Site Santa Fe, I was working with a bunch of high school students, and these young men were embroidering so fast that they decided that they would kind of create this collision between an Amazon drone, a UFO, and this raven. And for me, it kind of reminds me of a peachy folder, actually. These are the young men. And one thing that was really interesting is the instructors in this group, they said that some of these kids had ADD, and the stitching actually really helped focus their attention and energy. So I've been hosting open to the community sewing circles for about 15 years now, and it just was something that started not with the idea that it would last that long. I invited people over saying, no sewing experience is necessary. I'll feed you or give you a small print in exchange for your stitches. You can come and go as you wish, and please pass the invitation on to others. So this is the sewing circle at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, and in the course of 3 hours, we had 230 participants. And this is one of the sites that piece was stitched at. And so one of the things that happened with the sewing circles is originally I would have a composition, and people would kind of all work around a composition. And then when I was invited to go to the University of Washington and work with students, I knew I was going to have 60 students, and I didn't know how to translate my process to that large group. And so what I ended up doing is projecting my drawings onto these canvases of blankets, and then using tape as a patterning material, and then gridding the blankets and cutting it up into small quadrants. And then when the piece was near finished, that would be all stitched back together. So one thing that you might not notice, and I think it's really the plaid blanket that kind of conceals this, is that there's probably, I don't know, 80 panels that make those 2 pieces upstairs. And so the panels, and this will happen in the sewing circle, the panels have tape, and I just invite people to kind of go to the left of the tape or the right of the tape, and some people go over the tape. One thing I love about, did I say that I love people who don't have sewing experience? Because your stitches are really expressive. So please don't let that allow you to opt in. One thing that's interesting to me about this contributor here is that she really, in a way, her solution helped me think about where the piece might go forward. And in that way, I think the sewing circles have this element of call and response and improvisation that happens both at the sewing circle itself. So you might be looking over to see what your neighbor is doing and kind of decide whether you want to learn something new or maybe improvise in another direction. Or what happens with me in my studio is these pieces come back in different progression, or in different forms of completion and incompletion. And so when I look at everything, it takes me a lot of time to absorb what's there and think about what my next moves might be. So each person's stitch is unique, kind of like a thumbprint or fingerprint. That's okay. These were some blind contour drawings of ravens that I used in helping compose the piece. And so you can start to see, this piece actually went through a few different iterations based on that call and response process. So the pink embroidered marks really, or lines, the linear marks relate to those kind of blind contour drawings of ravens. And then there's editions of things that fly. One thing that was important to me about going to Santa Fe is then some of the things that fly in here also include hot air balloons, because that's important to New Mexico, UFOs, and then somewhere in here there's also an atom bomb. So one of my great challenges today is going to be not telling a story about everything I do. Because every piece has a story. And so this is where I'm going to actually just sort of run through some images so you can see some of the pieces that have been created. So I'm going back to this one. This is called Edson's flag, and that flag was given to my grandmother when our great uncle Ed passed away. It's revealed and concealed, but not cut or desecrated. And veterans are really important in our community, so I like to acknowledge him. So when I started sewing circles, I was thinking of barn raisings and how many hands make light work and how I could roll up my sleeves and help other people. And but I shortly, or maybe after the first year, I realized, oh, I love what happens when your eyes are diverted and you're working with something as familiar as cloth, and stories just sort of flow. And you learn things about people who you thought you knew really well already. You learn all kinds of things. But then it's also a chance to come together with neighbors or people who you might otherwise not ever meet and find commonality. So this is a sewing circle at the Denver Art Museum, simultaneous with the annual Denver Powwow. And this is the piece that came out of that. This is also the piece that really invited me to move my work away from the walls, because for jingles that are often used in powwow regalia, for them to be able to make their music, they need to be away from the wall. And what happens when the work then is away from the wall is it can be truer to its nature. So it becomes a blanket that you might wrap yourself in, or becomes kind of the side of a fort or a tent or a bed cover. Again, I'm trying not to talk. For anybody who knows me, it's very difficult. This title, Generous One's Chair Observer Ancestor, comes from an Emily Dickinson poem about mountains. Okay, beings. Actually, I learned something from Leah, one of the curators. She was talking about how hard it is to be in the exhibition and do a tour, because she wants to talk about everything in such great detail. And she feels like it's an injustice to just tell a little bit of the story. So for beings, I was thinking a lot about Sky Woman and how I might be able to make these columns connecting sky and ground that would be ladder-like. And so I started really thinking about how blankets are used in my community. In our tribe, we give away blankets to honor people for being witness to important life events. And I think that one of the things that's important about this custom is that many Indigenous communities also value blankets in a similar way. I started by scavenging for blankets at thrift stores, anything $5 and under, and I wouldn't pick a blanket for aesthetic reasons, although I do kind of think of each blanket I find as this unique tube of paint that might not otherwise exist, or that I might never find again. And one of the other things I was interested in is how these columns might reference linen closets, Brancusi's endless column, the conifers of the Pacific Northwest, and of course, Coast Salish totem poles that I grew up amongst. The piece in the foreground is made from a salvaged cedar beam, and it's created using 3D scanning and CNC technology. And in the back, there's a bronze piece. So I really quickly realized that blankets are storied objects, and I was lucky to be invited to collaborate with the Aldrich Museum. It's the first time I really asked the community, worked with the museum to invite people to from the community to share a blanket and the blanket's story in exchange for a print. These are my parents, Dave and Romaine Watt, and I affectionately refer to them as my roadies because they're often travel with me, and I'm sad that they're not here today, but they were very much involved in that installation. So my mom grew up on the Cattaraugus territory. My grandparents' first language is Seneca. My uncle is here today. My mom has 6 siblings. And she moved west to be a nurse and then worked in Indian education for 27 years in the Seattle area. And my dad grew up on homesteaded land in Wyoming, and he got a degree in engineering from the University of Wyoming and then headed west to work at Boeing. So I thought, since we were talking about beings, that I would kind of share these images. That last slide, the previous slide had images that were referred to this body of work, Skywalker, skyscraper. And I love it when words kind of have double meaning for me. So in our communities, we consider skywalkers our iron workers. So this is the first project in which every single blanket in this column was donated by the community. And this was at the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa for the Sakahan exhibition. And one thing I think is amazing is that people are so generous with their blankets and blanket stories. So this is, some of you have read it, and I will read it out loud. I remember the first time my grandfather told me that blankets came from sheep, and every time we went for a drive into the country, I would look for a white and green striped sheep. So one thing that's amazing is that people are invited to give proxy blankets to these projects, but they oftentimes contribute the original blanket. And I think that's a reflection on our desire to be connected to one another and to share our stories. And I can't read this one that well from where I am, so. This quilt was made by my grandmother, Edith Anderson Montour of the Six Nations Reserve, the first Native registered nurse in Canada and a First World War veteran of the U.S. Army Nursing Corps. The quilt includes patches of her own Army blankets and nurse's uniform. This quilt was used by 4 generations of the Montour and Moses families at Six Nations and is all about warmth and security and helping others. Ooh. We have another one to keep forever as a family heirloom. Nations. Oh. Okay. I was doing some research at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian as a fellow, and I learned that they categorize their cradle boards as transportation objects. And around the same time, I was looking on the internet for images of blankets in potlatches, because I'd heard that at some Coast Salish potlatches, there's written accounts that there's so many blankets present that the blankets were touching the scaffolding of these longhouses. It's like a lot of blankets. So I found this image, and what I love about it is the family is hosting the potlatch here, and they're casting this blanket to the community below. And the longer I looked at this image, I realized that this is 1913. And so from the late 1800s to the early 1950s, potlatches were actually banned in the United States and Canada. And what that means is that this gathering is actually an act of civil disobedience. So this is what is referred to as a double long trade blanket. And I kind of jokingly refer to it as an example of the early tax loophole. And the reason I say that is that when blankets were exported from England, traditionally they were exported as 2 blankets with directions on how to cut it along this line. And so this is what's referred to as a double long uncut blanket. These are the points, those little tiny, I'm not very good with this pointer here. Sorry, these points are tell you about the quality of the blanket and the goods and services that could have been traded for that blanket. And here I decided to, instead of having the people just raising their hands to receive the blanket, I would also have their hands a little bit more fist-like in solidarity. And I think the one thing that's really important, oh, I guess this is the detail, sorry. And so a little bit more fist-like in solidarity. And I also decided to include my daughters and myself in the blanket as witnesses to the potlatch. And one of the things my hope is with this piece is that when you're in front of it, it also is sort of cinematic in scope. And so I think that any viewer becomes a witness to this uncut tradition as well. So generations, how do we acknowledge our relatedness? I was trying to figure that out, especially as it relates, as a person who, I consider myself related to animals, but if you don't think of yourself as related to animals, what might be the entry point in Western culture? And I started thinking about our pets. And so, well, I am kind of a cat person. I decided I would look more closely at dogs. And so then I did as I often do, and I started looking at images in art history, and I thought, oh, the Capeltine wolf, this is like quite an incredible image because it's an image where it's a companion relationship. It made me start thinking a lot about the word mother. If you look at her face, she's exhausted. She's emaciated. That doesn't mean actually mothering is exhausting, but she is exhausted and she's emaciated. Her body is a shelter, protecting and nurturing and nourishing these twins. These twins are pretty plump, but I also think at a moment's notice, this mother could become ferocious. And so I started creating work thinking about the mother and the canopy of her body. So as a viewer, you would probably stand kind of underneath or lower than the canopy of her body. I also then started thinking about words related to the word mother and just kind of writing down a stream of consciousness connections to the word mother. And I was really interested in the word, not necessarily in a biological context, but like what characteristics do we all have that are mother-like? And so these are images from a sewing circle at the Block Museum at Northwestern University. And it's the first time where I used text in the work. And one of the things that I really was drawn to in this piece is how each word started to feel like in people's stitches. For the first time, I really almost saw like the cadence of one's voice in the mark of the stitches. Now, this person on the far right, her name is Melissa Blount, and I didn't know her before this sewing circle. But Melissa becomes incredibly important because, everybody who was at the sewing circle was very important. But one thing that has happened is I have a follow-up story to Melissa, and that is that after the sewing circle in New Haven, she's actually a clinical psychologist by day or by professional calling, but she decided to start a project called the Black Lives Matters Witness Quilt. And so now she is hosting sewing circles in her community, inviting people to reflect on women and girls who've died as a result of violence in Chicago. So here are some subsequent mother and canine images. In Seneca, an Iroquois means ancient one, and this is actually the last, it means great-grandmother and ancient one, and this is the last blanket my grandmother had on her bed before she passed away. So I told you that my mom worked in Indian education for 27 years, and she likes to say we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we can listen twice as hard. And for people who are printmakers in the room, I have been experimenting with using wool blankets, kind of cobbling them together in a smaller scale, and then using soft ground to run the image through the plate. So prior to the embroidery that happened on this small piece, this print was generated using that fabric. This is a drawing that was used to help make this next image. And this was created with amazing gaffer, Jeff Mack at the Corning Museum of Glass. And, you know, I knew I wanted to work sculpturally, but I honestly had not really just taken the plunge. And it almost took just collaborating with another material and another person to kind of make the next thing. So the next logical jump in scale was this. And this is called Companion Species Underbelly. And I felt like in order to really have this, like, kind of to talk about companion relationships, I needed to shift the scale, so we started thinking about how we're companion in our relationships with one another. All right, so I have a little video here. I realized we did not check for video, so hopefully this is going to work. Oh, good. So this is what the piece looked like in progress. Some things you might like to know about it is it weighs 1.5 tons. It breaks into 30 parts weighing from 100 to 300 pounds. It can pass through a 60-inch wide door frame. And it's the first time I've fabricated something that big in my studio. And the truth of the matter is that it feels like it's not quite the scale I want it to be, because one of my references, and I wish I had a slide of Nikki St. Detfall's hone figure, but I'm really interested in going larger and making it kind of more of a performative sculpture that people might be able to occupy and truly climb. Like my daughters, Maxine and Evelyn, are here partly for the purpose of scale. But this is yet not really, was not really created to be a piece to be climbed in this fashion. And I wanted to invite people into this space. I wanted people to be kind of, it to physically envelope me and just to be able to think further about this nurturing space, this, what is it? This, like, it's a really private space, right? It's not a space that we share easily with other people. It makes it a generous space too. So this is another reason why I think that we're companion species. I love this dog's tongue. This painting by is so this painting by Sargent is amazing to me, and I think the best part is that kind of lower left-hand corner. And I was thinking, well, our tongues are another example of our relatedness. And here's some other tongues in popular culture: the Hindu goddess Kali, as well as John Pash's design for the Rolling Stones. Tongues in these contexts are intimate, playful, and naughty. And this was a study. This is a larger piece, Companion Species Field. This is companion species, we are here now. For me, the X is a marker, a term of endearment, the way in which Indigenous people historically signed treaties, and it also feels like a standoff or an impasse. This is like a scale model, but all the tongues here made me think that at some point I want to create a tongue carpet that could be a performance space, a space for storytelling and unknown projects. So I've been obsessing with this word mother because it just seems so rich and also loaded and generous. And it made me more aware of Marvin Gaye's song, What's Going On, that was co-written by Obie Benson. And in that song, Marvin calls out mother, mother, father, father, brother, brother, sister, sister. And it got me thinking really about how in Indigenous communities in my tribe, we talk about all my relations and this idea of extended family. I think one thing that's important to note is that Obie Benson is the person who started the song, and it was partly because he was on a bus that drove by this protest in People's Park in Berkeley. And this is 1969, so you have the American Indian movement and the occupation of Alcatraz. Martin Luther King has actually just been assassinated the year before, I believe. And I think one thing that speaks to me about this time and thinking about it, but also I think that there's some parallels between what's happening right now in our culture, right? We've got Black Lives Matters, we've got water issues in Flint, we've got water concerns in Standing Rock. And I think that we could all go on and fill in some blanks about things that are of importance and concern to us. So this piece is called Declaration. So this is companion species speech bubble. And one of the things that I sort of like about this is not only does it remind me of kind of a speech bubble, but it also, or this, like the way a speech bubble looks in graphic novels if you were to be screaming something, but it also kind of reminds me of a tongue. And these were stitched both in Arkansas at 5 different locations in conjunction and collaboration with the Crystal Bridges Museum. But we went to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and then there were a lot of neighboring sites within Bentonville. And then it went on further to Honolulu and was stitched at the Bishop Museum and the Honolulu Museum of Art's Spalding House. So with this piece, there's like an A side and a B side, so what we're seeing is the B side. And I like it, I'm interested in how we see kind of what I think normally would be called like the imperfect part of one stitching, but I actually find that it is it's almost more honest to what our interior lives might look like, complicated, messy, but still really, hopefully, beautiful. So tomorrow, I'm co-hosting an open to the community sewing circle, and these are pressure prints that were made for the project, and especially in honor of this occasion and event. So there's 2 prints. One is First Teachers, the other is Sapling and Flint, who are twins, that I will share more about at another time. I believe, this almost concludes my presentation. So there's Gordon Bettles, who is the retired steward of the University of Oregon Many Nations Longhouse, likes to say, my story changes when I know your story. And I can tell you that my story has changed for being at this place and for returning here today, for having family and friends in the room, and for the new ones and new connections that are about to be formed. So thank you so much for coming today and for... So I'm here to answer any questions, but I also really want to thank Joseph and Leah and Katie and all the people who came together to make this place, to make this place so welcoming, but also to really move the college forward and move the community forward and to bring us all together today. It's really amazing. It's really quite a feat, and it's such an honor to be here. So, Niawe.
What is a potlatch?
Okay. I will try to give you my best my best definition of a potlatch, not being from a Coast Salish community. Potlatch is a gift-giving celebration in which the host family gives gifts to the community, and it's a part of the economy of Coast Salish. Traditionally, it was a part of the economy of Coast Salish communities, but it was also, potlatches were held in a way to kind of reflect your social standing in the community. And so one thing that's interesting about potlatches being banned is that our federal government thought that it was a really backward way of expressing wealth, right? Like it's kind of an anti-capitalist model because it's about giving away your wealth as a way of showing your standing in the community rather than acquiring it. And of course, the other reason why potlatches were banned is because they didn't want Indigenous people to gather and then, retaliate. Well, they didn't want Indigenous people to gather and scheme or plan or, yeah. Yes, please do. Thank you. I should have asked that first. Thank you so much.
Well, I can't really speak to it very strongly, but I am from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory over in Vancouver. And potlatches are a time of calling people together to witness your family's history and the stories that you want to share. So you'd invite people and they'd witness your stories. You'd have several people. You'd have designated witnesses, but also other people. And then you give as a gesture of respect and thanks and kind of to protect those stories as well. So that's just to add on. Like, it's not the full understanding, but
yeah.
I think
Thank
that's
you.
important.
It's very important. Thank you.
I was surprised at the importance of the Pendleton blanket, since I think of that as being manufactured by colonial people to perhaps sell, you know, get money out of Native people. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but the respect that Native people have for Pendleton blankets is really astonishing. There was the National Museum of the American Indian gave Pendleton blankets as sort of a thank you for certain donations, and so it's very tied in. And how do you reconcile the fact that it's not a native product, but is so honored by Native communities?
Well, I think Indigenous people have always been involved in trade and using new materials in a way that furthers our communities or our aesthetic expressions. And so, I mean, I think that, and there's also, in addition to what you're sharing with blankets, there's also this notion that blankets introduce disease to Indigenous people as well. And I think one thing that's interesting to me then about both of those things, though, is I think that we've transformed our relationship with those objects in a way that that they're more than it's more than where it came from. Like it's less maybe about it being a Pendleton, although I agree with you, a lot of Pendleton blankets are given away to honor people. But I think that it's more about what those blankets stand for in our history, in our histories. Is there somebody else who wants to take a stab at answering that question? I love having so many Indigenous people in the same room because other people might have some other opinions on it.
Yeah, I think that like there's multiple understandings to Pendleton blankets, as you were saying. I think that within communities, Pendleton blankets can be very important, but there's also been a movement by many Native people to actually purchase blankets from companies like 8th Generation, which are Native owned and designed to sort of move away from giving money solely to non-Native companies. But I think what's really interesting about Marie Watt's work is the use of the phrase reclaimed wool blankets, which I think I understand it in sort of multiple ways. One being that, you know, these blankets maybe have been used before and are reclaimed in that way, but also the act of like creating these new works of art is also a reclaiming. And so to Marie's point about Indigenous people changing their relationship to Pendleton blankets, I think this is like one way that we see that happening.
Your work is absolutely beautiful and very moving, and thank you very much for sharing so much of it with us today. Does the work inform the gatherings where so much of your work is produced, or is it the other way around?
I think it kind of goes, it often goes both ways. Like, you know, the piece that the sewing circle that was held in Denver at the Denver Art Museum, it actually came out of being an artist in resident in Denver and having a sewing circle where some girls who were there from a day camp, they were telling me that they danced in powwows. And I've attended many powwows, but I am not a powwow dancer. And I asked them to share more about the dances they did. And one young woman was a jingle dress dancer, and the other was a fancy shawl dancer. And so I actually created the piece Butterfly, hoping to see them when I came back to do a sewing circle at the powwow. So that's like an example of something that really, like, I want to share this story as I understand it, and maybe it's my contribution to powwow because that's my way of dancing. Okay, so there's there's that part of it. I mean, I think one thing that is really important in my practice is going back to communities. So not just like going once and then leaving, but the thing that even with going to the National Gallery of Canada, like first doing the collaboration on the large sculpture, but then returning for the sewing circles and connecting with people who gave blankets to that sculpture. And then, who knows, maybe there's a possibility of going back there again, but I'm really interested in these kind of long conversations. There are also other times where I'm kind of working with a specific idea, and then it changes. The sewing circle piece that I'll be sharing with people tomorrow, it draws from the language and words of Joy Harjo. And that was partly inspired because last week I was doing a sewing circle in Washington, D.C., and I thought, what a better way to like be in Washington, D.C. than like stitch words that come from the poet Joy Harjo's, universe. And so, hopefully that answers that question a little bit. Thank you.
What is a blind contour drawing?
Oh, blind contour drawing. Every drawing student should do a blind contour drawing. It is a drawing, and actually, even if you're not an art student, you should do a blind contour drawing. A blind contour drawing is when you look at an image, and it could be in landscape, it could be on a table, or it could be a photograph. But when you look at an image, and you put your pen down or your drawing tool down, and you just look at the image, and you really try not to look at your drawing. You just look at the image, and you move your hand along as if you're kind of tracing each contour and, outer edge of that image. And so I think one of the things that I like about it is it's like it tricks you into seeing things in a way that gives it maybe truer expressive life than if you were to try to draw it, especially something from a photograph. Yeah. There's also another drawing project where you can put something in a bag and feel it and draw it, which actually makes me think of my grandfather. My mom's dad, he was blind, and we would see him when we visited him. We would see him by him touching our face, and vice versa. And my mom said that whenever she couldn't find her shoes when she was racing for the school bus, my grandfather always knew where they were. But that's a side story. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.